All right, let's get into it. We're about to unpack one of the most incredible stories of the 20th century. I mean, how on earth do millions of people living under colonial rule come together to forge a nation? Well, that's the story of India's national movement.
And let's be clear, this wasn't some quiet, simple process. Not at all. It was a real struggle, full of intense conflict, protest, and a whole lot of sacrifice. You know, that journey from just a collection of territories to a unified nation, it was truly forged in fire.
So, that really brings us to the central puzzle of this whole thing. How does something like that even happen? Seriously, how do you take this vast, incredibly diverse population and unite them behind one single powerful idea, the idea of a country of their own?
Well, to get to the bottom of it, we've got to go back, way back, to the late 19th century. Because that's when the stage was really being set with this growing, simmering frustration against British rule.
You know, it all kicked off with a really fundamental question. People were looking around and thinking, wait a minute, who is this country actually for? They saw British control over everything, their resources, their laws, their daily lives. And the answer that started taking shape was pretty clear. India belongs to the people of India. And as long as the British were in charge, that could never really be true.
And look, this wasn't just some vague unhappiness. It was a direct reaction to some really repressive laws. You had the Arms Act in 1878, which basically said Indians couldn't have weapons. Same year, the Vernacular Press Act comes along and silences any newspapers that dared to criticize the government. But the real kicker? That was the Ilbert Bill controversy in '83. The British basically refused to let Indian judges preside over cases involving Europeans. I mean, that sent a crystal clear message about racial inequality. So yeah, this frustration, it was fueled by very real, very specific policies.
And out of all this frustration, a really powerful idea starts to catch on: sovereignty. The idea that the people of India should be sovereign. Now, what does that actually mean? It's the ability to act on your own, to make your own decisions without someone else pulling the strings. It means being in charge of your own destiny. And that concept, it became the absolute cornerstone of this new wave of nationalism.
Okay, so the problem is clear, right? Widespread discontent. But what's the first answer? What's the first game plan? Well, the early nationalists, they had a very methodical, and you might even say, a pretty optimistic approach.
And here's one of the key players from that era, Dadabhai Naoroji. He was a major leader in the early Indian National Congress, which got started back in 1885. Now, he and the other leaders, they were typically educated professionals, think lawyers, businessmen. They really were the first generation to create an organized national political platform in India.
So what was their strategy? Well, we call them the moderates, and that's because they weren't trying to overthrow the government. Not yet, anyway. Their goal was to get a greater voice inside the system. They did this by writing articles, giving speeches, and sending a lot of petitions. The key thing to get here is their core belief. They genuinely thought that if they could just point out the injustices to the British sense of justice and fair play would kick in, and things would change.
But, well, you can probably guess what happened. That process was slow. Painfully slow. For a lot of people, this whole politics of petitions thing just wasn't working fast enough, and that impatience gave rise to a brand new, much more assertive strategy.
And this quote, it just perfectly captures that frustration. This new generation of leaders looked at the moderates and thought, you're not demanding anything, you're begging. They started calling it the politics of prayers, and they argued it was time for a much, much stronger approach.
So here's the breakdown, and it's a huge shift. You have the moderates on one side, with their petitions and speeches just hoping for a bigger voice. And then you have the radicals, as they were called. Their method? Mass mobilization, boycotts. Their goal wasn't just a voice, it was Swaraj, self-rule. And they had zero faith in British justice. For them, it was all about self-reliance. And this became their rallying cry, a line that just perfectly sums up that new, defiant spirit. Freedom is my birthright, and I shall have it. See? That's not a request, that's a declaration.
And here he is. This is the man behind those powerful words, Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He, along with guys like Bipin Chandra Pal and Lala Lajpat Rai, really led this new radical charge. Their message was simple. Indians have to rely on their own strength to win their freedom. Then, in 1905, something happens that basically proves the radicals were right all along. The British decide to partition Bengal. They said it was for administrative convenience, but everyone saw right through it. It was a classic divide and conquer move, meant to break the back of the nationalist movement. But wow, Did it backfire? It infuriated people across the country, sparking massive protests and really fueling the Swadeshi movement, where people boycotted British goods. So we've had the politics of petitions, and then we had the rise of more radical, direct action. But there was still a missing piece. The movement was still mostly limited to the educated classes. The big question was, how do you get everyone involved? How do you take this to the masses? The answer, as it turns out, would come with a new leader who would change the entire game, Mahatma Gandhi.
So Gandhi comes back to India from South Africa in 1915, and the timing is critical. World War I is raging, and it's completely changing the landscape. The war brought huge economic hardship for ordinary Indians. We're talking high taxes, soaring prices. It created this perfect storm of discontent, just waiting for a leader who could tap into it and turn it into a national movement.
And Gandhi's playbook? Absolutely genius. The non-cooperation movement, which kicked off around 1920, was all about nationwide nonviolent resistance. But it wasn't just about giving speeches. It was about actions, things everyone could do. Students walked out of government schools. Lawyers quit their jobs. People gave back their British titles and boycotted legislatures. And all over the country, they lit these huge public bonfires of foreign-made cloth.
And this was the result. All of a sudden, the freedom struggle wasn't just something talked about in fancy drawing rooms anymore. Nope, it was out on the streets, it was in the villages, you had peasants, students, workers, women, everyone. It had finally, truly become a mass movement.
And that brings us to the final, and maybe most important stage of this evolution. It became a true people's movement, because people from every walk of life found a way to make it their own.
Okay, so here's what made Gandhi's approach so revolutionary. The idea of Swaraj, of self-rule, it wasn't some strict one-size-fits-all thing. It was more like an empty vessel that different groups could fill with their own hopes and struggles. So for peasants in Gujarat, Swaraj meant fighting high taxes. For tribal groups in Andhra Pradesh, it meant staging forced satyagrahas to reclaim their land. For tea garden workers in Assam, it meant demanding better wages. You see, for the very first time, people could connect this huge national idea directly to their own local fights for justice. And that, well, that changed everything.
And because of this connection, Gandhi became more than just a political leader. He took on this almost mythical status. To millions, he was a messiah, a kind of savior who really understood their suffering and could help them end it. He became known as the people's Mahatma.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. Get this. This is from a British intelligence report from 1921. Even his opponents were blown away by his influence. The report says his name had this astonishing currency even in the most remote villages. And it goes on to say, no one seems to know quite who or what he is, but it is an accepted fact that what he says is so.
Wow. So there you have it. From polite petitions to radical boycotts to a massive nonviolent movement involving millions. The very idea of India was forged over decades of struggle. It wasn't just one idea, was it? It was a whole evolution of ideas and strategies. Which kind of leaves us with one last big question. What makes an idea spark a revolution? Is it the leader, the strategy, or is it just about hitting that perfect moment in history when millions of people are finally ready to demand a different future?